The station was enormous. It floated above a gas giant so large that it made most planets look like pebbles. The station had been built over thousands of years by dozens of species. Every wall, every corridor, every great hall carried the marks of 100 different civilizations. The lights changed color depending on which section you walked through. The air smelled different in every wing. Some parts were cold and dry. Some were hot and wet. The Galactic Council had made this station its home, and it was the most powerful place in the known galaxy. Junho stepped off the transport ship and looked around. He had been here before, 11 times to be exact. Once for every year humanity had been a member of the council. But this time felt different. He was not nervous. He was not excited either. He was calm in the way that a person is calm when they have already made a decision and there is nothing left to think about. He was not a tall man. He was not loud. He wore a plain dark suit, no medals, no symbols, no species markings. Every other delegate who passed him in the docking corridor wore something elaborate. The Veldari wore long silver robes with rank markings on their shoulders. The Sothine came in groups, their bodies connected at the shoulder by thin organic threads, moving like one creature with many heads. The Muran delegates wore ceremonial face coverings painted in deep red and gold. Everyone wore something that said who they were and how important they were. Junho wore a dark suit. He was followed by two people. The first was Dane, a young woman with short hair and quick eyes. She carried a flat tablet under her arm and had already read everything on it twice before they landed. She had a habit of tapping her fingers when she was thinking, and right now her fingers were very busy. The second was Wu. He was older, broader, and said almost nothing. He walked slightly behind and to the right of Junho, and his eyes moved constantly, watching everything. He looked like a man who was counting exits. They were shown to their assigned quarters, which were the same small rooms in the same secondary wing they had been given every year. The rooms were fine but clearly not important. The Veldari had an entire floor. The Sothine Collective had a pressurized wing built specifically for their atmosphere. Humanity had 3 rooms and a window that looked out at a maintenance dock. Dane dropped her bag and opened her tablet. "The session starts in 4 hours," she said. "I know," Junho said. "The agenda has the boundary dispute listed as the first and only main item. We're listed as observers. No speaking rights unless we formally request the floor." "I know that too," he said. Wu said nothing. He stood near the window and looked at the maintenance dock. The grand hall, when they entered it, was overwhelming. 12,000 seats rose in curved tiers around a central floor. The floor was polished white stone, and the podium at its center was raised on a platform that could be seen from every seat in the building. The ceiling was made of a transparent material that showed the stars outside. Billions of kilometers away, the gas giant Velorum Prime swirled in slow orange and brown patterns. Junho, Dane, and Wu were shown to their seats. The seats were in the 43rd row, slightly to the left, partially behind a wide pillar. They were observer seats, good enough to see everything, not good enough to matter. The hall filled slowly. The noise was constant and layered, hundreds of languages speaking at once, the universal translation system working quietly inside every delegate's earpiece. Junho put his in and heard the noise resolve into something almost understandable, a blur of complaints and greetings and political small talk. The session opened with the standard readings, a long ceremonial recitation of the Council's founding principles. Junho had heard it 11 times. He sat still and listened. Then came the boundary dispute. 3 elder civilizations, the Veldari, the Sothine Collective, and the Muran Theocracy, were dividing a cluster of uninhabited star systems in the middle of a contested region. The systems had no life on them. They had minerals, energy sources, and strategic positioning. Each of the 3 powers wanted more than the others were willing to give. This had been going on for 6 years. The debate was complicated and long. Junho followed it carefully. At one point, a Veldari high speaker, A tall creature with pale skin and 4 narrow eyes stood at the podium and made a sweeping argument about territorial rights. He was confident and smooth. He was used to being listened to. At the end of his argument, he gestured toward the observer section without looking at it. Even the unnamed species of Sol 3 was permitted to observe today, he said. His voice carried no heat. It was not even a real insult. It was something worse. It was dismissal. He said it the way a person mentions furniture. I trust they have found their seats without difficulty. The hall rippled, not with anger, with laughter. Soft, layered, alien laughter from 1,000 throats and vocal organs and sound-producing membranes. It moved through the tiers like a small wave. Junho did not move. He did not change his expression. He did not look at Dane or Wu. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small card. He wrote 4 words on it. Then he folded it and passed it sideways to Dane without looking at her. Dane took the card. She opened it under her tablet so it was hidden from the rows above and below. She read it. Her fingers, which had been tapping since they left the ship, went completely still. The card said, "Today, we do it today." She looked at Junho. He was watching the podium, his face unchanged. She looked at Wu. Wu had been watching the high speaker. Now he turned and looked at the card in Dane's hand. He read it. He turned back to face the front of the hall. Under the arm of his chair, slowly, he pressed his knuckles together until they made a quiet sound. The session continued. The 3 powers argued. Numbers were thrown around. Maps were displayed on the central holographic platform, star systems blinking in and out as claimed territory changed color. It was all very professional and very dull and very much designed to exclude anyone who was not already part of the conversation. Junho watched it all. He watched the way the Veldari high speaker moved around the floor as if he owned it. He watched the Sothine delegates communicate in their clustermind shorthand, their shoulders barely moving. He watched the Murran representatives sit like statues, their red and gold masks unreadable. He thought about how long humanity had been coming to this hall and sitting in these back seats and being introduced as Sol 3 and being given observer chairs behind pillars. 11 years. He thought about the years before that, the decades of preparation, the files Dane had been building, the things Wu knew and never spoke about, the quiet, patient, very human process of getting ready. He had never been a man who moved quickly. Quick movement drew attention and wasted energy. He believed in waiting until the moment was exactly right. His grandmother had been a chess player, and she had told him once that the best move is never the one that attacks first. The best move is the one that changes what the board means. He thought today was that move. The session broke for a recess period. Delegates rose and stretched and moved toward refreshment areas. The noise in the hall grew loose and social. Nobody moved toward the 3 humans in row 43. Nobody ever did. Dane leaned close to Junho. "Are you sure?" she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "Once we do this, there is no quiet version of us anymore." "There was never a quiet version," Junho said. "There was only a version they hadn't noticed yet." Dane sat back. Her fingers started tapping again, but it was a different rhythm now, faster, like something counting down. Wu looked at the podium at the center of the white stone floor. That was where it would happen. That was where everything would change. He had waited 6 years for this. He thought he could wait another 40 minutes. The lights in the grand hall shifted, signaling the end of recess. 12,000 seats began to fill again. The stars turned slowly above the transparent ceiling. Velorum Prime swirled in the dark. Junho straightened his jacket. He looked at the podium. Then he looked at Dane and gave her a small nod. She opened her tablet and began preparing the formal request for floor access, the one that had been written and rewritten and perfected over the last 3 years, the one that said, in perfect council legal language, that the delegation of Sol 3 wished to speak. The request appeared on Speaker Oreth's console like a small, unimportant notification. He looked at it the way a person looks at a fly that has landed on the edge of their plate. It was not dangerous. It was not interesting. It was simply there, and it had to be dealt with before the session could continue properly. The request was from the Sol 3 delegation. They were asking for floor access, speaking rights, the chance to stand at the central podium and address the full council. Oreth leaned toward his aide, a thin Veldari with careful eyes, and said something quietly. The aide nodded and sent back a standard confirmation. The request was approved. It was technically required to be approved. The council charter granted floor access to all member species. No one had ever thought to restrict the rule because no one had ever imagined that a species as new and as unimportant as the humans would actually use it. When the confirmation arrived in Dane's tablet, she exhaled slowly. "We have the floor," she said. Junho stood up. He walked down from the 43rd row through the long, curved aisle, past delegates from dozens of species who glanced at him with mild curiosity or no interest at all. He was short and plainly dressed, and he moved without hurry. By the time he reached the bottom of the aisle and stepped onto the white stone floor, the hall had already started to settle back into a quiet murmur. A few delegates checked their information screens to see who was approaching the podium. Most saw the designation Sol 3 and looked away again. Junho walked to the podium. He stood there for a moment, looking out at 12,000 seats. The lights were strong and the hall was very large. He had practiced this in a room in Geneva for 2 years. He had practiced it in his head for longer than that. He placed both hands on the sides of the podium and looked up at the tiers. He began to speak. His voice was calm and clear, and the translators carried it perfectly. He said that humanity had been a member of the Galactic Council for 11 years. He said that in those 11 years, they had listened carefully, followed every rule, signed every treaty they were asked to sign, and never once caused a disruption. He said they were grateful to be part of the council. He said he meant that sincerely. Then he said that in 11 years he had noticed something. He had noticed that his world had never once been referred to by its name, only by its coordinates. Sol 3, a location, a designation, a number in a catalog. He said he would like to fix that today. He said the word. Earth. The translators processed it. The word moved through 12,000 earpieces. It was a simple word, short, 1 syllable. The translation came back as the ground, the soil, the surface of the world. Several species had words like it. The concept was not remarkable. A few delegates nodded slightly and wrote something on their consoles, expecting a brief formality. Junho let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "But that is only the name of our world. What we call ourselves, the people of that world, is something older and something different." He said the second word. Human. The translators paused, not for long, half a second, maybe less. But in a hall this large, with this many connected systems running simultaneously, half a second of translation delay was noticeable. Several delegates looked up from their consoles. The translation systems were not broken. They were pulling context. The word human was not simply a species label. It came loaded with attached information, etymology chains, historical records, philosophical texts, legal documents, religious writings, scientific papers. The AI systems processing the translation were doing what they always did with complex words. They were finding the best way to carry the full meaning across to every species present. And the full meaning was complicated. Human, from the old language of one of Earth's dead empires, related to the word for soil, for the ground, for the earth itself. But also, and this was the part that made the systems pause, related to the concept of mortality. To be human was to be temporary, to be fragile, to know you would die and to keep moving anyway. And woven through it, deep in the roots of the word, was something else. The capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary kindness, sometimes in the same person. Sometimes in the same hour. The translation finished. The word arrived in 12,000 earpieces. Several delegates sat very still. Junho reached into his jacket and removed a small drive. He connected it to the podium's main display port. He said, "I would like to share something with the council. It will take 6 minutes. I ask that you watch all of it." He pressed the button. The holographic platform above the center floor came to life. It was not a map this time. It was not a political chart or a resource diagram. It was footage. Real footage, recorded and preserved and organized by Dane over 3 years, verified and sourced and timestamped. It was Earth's history. It started from the beginning, not the beginning of human civilization, the beginning of the human story, 200,000 years ago, small groups of creatures on a vast savanna, barely surviving, cold seasons that killed most of them, predators larger and faster than they were. No claws, no armor, no natural weapons beyond what their hands could hold or their minds could build. It moved forward, slowly at first, then faster. Villages, then cities, then wars. The footage did not flinch. It showed the wars clearly and without apology, the scale of them, the technology of them. Weapons that started as sharpened stone and became things that could erase a city in a single moment. It showed the plagues, diseases that moved across continents and killed 1 in every 3 people and still did not stop humanity from rebuilding. It showed the famines, the floods, the years when the sky itself turned dark from fires humans had set, accidentally or on purpose. It showed the things humans did to each other, the cruelties, the systems of oppression built by some humans over others, lasting for centuries, then torn down, sometimes slowly and sometimes violently, by the very people who had been crushed under them. And then it showed the other side, the hospitals built in the middle of wars, the people who ran toward burning buildings to pull out strangers, the scientists who spent their entire lives working on cures for diseases that would kill millions of people they had never met, the teachers, the builders, the ones who kept records so the ones who came later would know what had happened and could try to do better. It showed the moment humans first left their planet. A small metal vehicle barely larger than a bedroom launched on a controlled explosion into empty space. The crew inside were 3 people who knew there was a real chance they would not come back. The footage caught one of them laughing just before launch, not from fear, just laughing, because it was extraordinary and they were there for it. The 6 minutes ended. The hall was silent. Not politely silent, not the silence of an audience waiting for the next speaker. It was the silence of 12,000 creatures who had just seen something they did not know how to organize inside their minds. Somewhere in the upper tiers, a Sothine delegate turned its many-threaded body toward the cluster beside it. Its communication was internal and fast, but the words, later recovered from a council session log, were simple. They did all of this to themselves, and then quieter, and they are still here. Speaker Aurath sat at the head of the council floor. He had been in this chair for 40 years. He had seen wars declared from this hall. He had seen species vote to abandon entire star systems. He had mediated disputes that lasted decades. He was not a creature who was easily moved. But he was gripping the edge of his dais with both hands, and he did not realize he was doing it. He had made the same mistake everyone else had made. He had looked at how recently humanity arrived in space and assumed that was the beginning of the story. He had not considered that the story was 300,000 years old before it ever left the planet. He had not considered what it meant to be a species that survived everything it ever encountered, including itself. Junho looked out at the hall. He did not look satisfied. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had introduced himself properly for the first time and was waiting to see how the other person would respond. He said one last thing before stepping back from the podium. "My name is Junho. I represent Earth. I represent humans. We are glad to be here, and we would like from this point forward to be addressed accordingly." He walked back toward row 43. Dane watched him come. Wu watched the hall. Neither of them spoke. Around them, 12,000 delegates sat in a silence that felt like the moment before weather changes. Something had shifted in the room. They could not yet name what it was, but something was different, and every living creature in that hall could feel it, even the ones who did not yet understand why. The session ended 2 hours after Junho returned to his seat. The boundary dispute, which had been the entire reason for the gathering, was quietly postponed. No one said out loud that the humans had caused the postponement. No one needed to. The energy in the hall had changed too much for any serious negotiation to continue. Delegates filed out in clusters, speaking quietly to each other in their own languages, and those conversations did not stop when they reached the corridors. They continued all the way back to private quarters and communication rooms, and encrypted transmission suites. The council station had a research wing that most delegates never used. It was a long, quiet section of the station where archived records were stored and where analysts and advisors could access the council's data systems. That night, every terminal in the research wing was occupied. The Veldari sent 12 researchers. The Sothine Collective networked its entire analytical submind to pull and process data. The Murin theocracy sent only one person, but that one person worked for 18 straight hours and did not eat. They were all doing the same thing. They were checking the humans' history against their own records, looking for errors, looking for exaggerations, looking for any reason to dismiss what they had seen in that hall. They did not find any errors. What they found instead made things considerably worse. The Veldari had records of every species that had ever applied for council membership. They had developed a system over centuries for predicting how dangerous a new species might eventually become. The system looked at things like technological growth rate, territorial expansion speed, and historical aggression levels. Humanity had been run through this system when they first applied. The result had come back low. The Veldari analysts had nodded, filed the result, and moved on. Now they ran the system again, this time feeding it the complete historical record that Junho had presented. The result came back so high that 2 of the researchers thought the system had broken. They ran it a 3rd time, same result. The issue was not their aggression levels. The issue was their recovery rate. A normal species, when damaged badly enough, entered a long decline. Populations dropped, technology regressed, expansion slowed. Every species in the council had experienced this at least once. It was considered a natural part of civilizational development. Humans did not decline. They had been hit with catastrophes that should have ended them dozens of times, and each time they had rebuilt faster than the time before. The system could not explain this. It had not been designed to account for a species that treated near extinction as a temporary setback. The Veldari chief researcher sent a report to Speaker Orath at 3 in the morning. The report was long and carefully worded, but its conclusion was short. The council had been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of what humanity was. They had classified Earth as a young civilization. Technically, this was true. Humanity had been in space for less than 200 years, which was extremely young by galactic standards, but they had been a civilization for far longer than that. They had been in conflict with each other and with their environment and with everything that tried to kill them for 300,000 years. The experience did not disappear when they left their planet. They brought it with them. In the Murin wing, a woman named Rena sat alone at a terminal and stared at her screen for a long time. Rena was human. She had been born on Earth, grown up on Earth, and then left it at the age of 23 to study xenosociology. She had eventually settled in Murin space, married into a Murin academic family, and spent the last 10 years advising the Murin High Council on alien relations matters. She was considered very useful because she could explain human behavior to creatures who found it completely baffling. She had thought until today that this was a fairly comfortable position to be in. Now the Murin High Council had called her in at midnight to explain what had just happened in the Grand Hall. She sat across from 7 senior Murren officials in a room that smelled of the incense they burned during serious discussions. The officials were all wearing their formal masks. That meant the meeting was being recorded and considered official. One of them asked her the question they all wanted answered. The recovery rate, the numbers our researchers are finding, is this accurate? Rena thought for a moment, then she said yes. She told them what she had grown up knowing but had stopped thinking about because it was simply the water she had always swum in. She told them that humans did not have a cultural concept of permanent defeat. They had the concept of losing. They had the concept of being destroyed. But they did not have the concept that losing meant it was over. Every story they told each other, from the earliest ones scratched onto cave walls to the ones broadcast across global networks, carried the same basic shape. Something terrible happens. The person it happens to keeps going anyway. That was not propaganda or mythology for humans. That was simply how they understood life to work. The Murren officials listened carefully. One of them asked, "How did we not know this?" Rena said, "You never asked us our name before." The room was quiet after that. In a different part of the station, Wu was awake. He had barely slept. He stood in the small room he shared with a monitoring console that most people would have assumed was standard communication equipment. It was not. It had been installed by a council station maintenance worker named Hana 6 years ago, before anyone was paying attention to the humans enough to wonder what their maintenance worker was doing. Wu was receiving transmissions from Earth, short, encrypted, fast. He decoded them one by one, read each one, and set them aside. Earth's Unified Strategic Command had been watching the session via the quantum stream broadcast. They had seen the presentation. They had seen the silence in the hall. They were ready. Wu typed back a single response. It was 3 words, "Proceed as planned." He set the console to standby and sat back. He looked at the wall. He thought about the Veldari High Speaker who had made the joke about the unnamed species from Sol 3 that afternoon. He thought about the laughter that had moved through the hall like a small wave. He thought about how that moment would look in a historical record someday, and what kind of footnote it would be. He almost smiled. The next morning, Dane arrived at the research wing early, before most of the council's regular analysts had started their shifts. She had requested access to one of the smaller meeting rooms, which had been granted without question. Nobody thought much about a human delegate using a meeting room. Nobody thought much about humans at all, as a general habit. The meeting room filled slowly over the next hour. The delegates who entered did not come in official robes or with large entourages. They came quietly, 1 or 2 at a time, wearing their ordinary daily clothes. They were delegates from smaller civilizations, species that had been council members for a long time but had never had seats at the big tables, species that had signed agreements they were not fully happy with because the alternative was to be excluded entirely. They had been watching humanity from the same back rows for 11 years, and they had been watching the presentation from the day before with a different kind of attention than the elder powers. Dane greeted each one. She offered them water, which was a human custom that some of them found strange and some found touching. When the room was full, she opened her tablet and began to talk. She did not talk about the presentation. She did not talk about Earth's history or humanity's resilience or any of the things that had filled the research wing discussions the night before. She talked about something very specific. She talked about the treaties humanity had signed in its first 11 years of council membership. She showed them, one clause at a time, how many of those treaties had been quietly unfavorable to Earth, trade routes that benefited the larger powers, resource agreements that gave humanity access to lower-grade materials while elder species kept the high-value deposits, boundary agreements that left human expansion corridors narrow and easily blocked. None of it had been illegal. All of it had been done in the normal way of large powers dealing with small ones. Sign here. This is the standard arrangement. Several delegates in the room were nodding before she finished. They had signed the same kinds of documents. They knew exactly what she was describing because they had lived it for much longer than 11 years. Then she showed them the second file, the one Wu had cleared for release that morning, after the transmissions from Earth came through. She set it on the table in the center of the room and let them read it at their own pace. It was a readiness file, Earth's military status, the number of vessels, their classes, their positions, the technologies they carried. It had all been built quietly over decades, while humanity sat in back rows and signed unfavorable treaties and let the galaxy assume they were still finding their footing. The room was very quiet for a long time. One delegate, a small pale creature from a water world in the outer systems, looked up from the file and said, "How long have they had this?" Dane said, "Long enough." The delegate looked back at the file, then it said quietly, almost to itself, "They were never lost, they were waiting." Dane did not confirm or deny that. She just picked up her tablet and moved to the next item on her list. There was still a great deal of work to do before the next session, and she had never been someone who wasted time. The inner chamber of the Galactic Council was not shown on any public map of the station. It was not mentioned in the official session schedules. It had no designation in the standard directory. It existed in a section of the station that was listed on maintenance logs as a ventilation management corridor, and it had been used for quiet, off-record meetings by the Council's most powerful members for over 300 years. 21 delegates gathered there the morning after Junho's presentation. They represented the 7 oldest and most powerful civilizations in the Council. They were not in ceremonial dress. Some of them had come in what passed for casual clothing among their species. They were tired and they were unsettled, and they wanted to deal with the problem before it grew any larger. Speaker Orath opened the meeting. He did not call it a meeting. He called it a conversation. That was the kind of language used in rooms like this, where nothing was officially decided and nothing was officially recorded, but where most of the real decisions about galactic politics were actually made. He described the situation plainly. A junior member species had used their legal floor rights to deliver a presentation that was now being replayed and discussed across thousands of star systems. The translation systems had distributed the session broadcast automatically, as they always did. There was no way to take it back. The presentation had been seen. The history had been shared. The word human was now in the galactic vocabulary, whether anyone wanted it there or not. He asked the room for options. The first option came from the Sothine representative, which was a cluster of 3 individuals operating as one voice. It said that humanity could be removed from the Council on a procedural technicality. There were several possible grounds. The presentation had not been a scheduled agenda item. The historical file shared through the Council's display system had not been submitted for prior approval. These were minor violations, but in Council law, minor violations could be escalated if enough senior members agreed to push them. Orath considered this. He asked how long the process would take. The Sothine representative said 3 to 5 months. Orath asked what would happen in those 3 to 5 months while the procedure was ongoing and every civilization in the galaxy was watching. The Sothine representative did not have a good answer. The second option came from the Murin delegate, who suggested a quieter approach, offer humanity something, an upgraded council seat, better trade access, a seat on a minor subcommittee, something that looked like a reward and would give them enough to feel satisfied without actually changing any of the existing power arrangements. This had worked with other small species before. Give them enough to feel included. Keep them inside where they can be managed. Orath said, "And if they refuse?" The Murin delegate had no answer either. The third option no one actually said out loud. It hung in the room anyway, the way certain ideas do, unspoken but present. The idea of using something other than political or legal tools to deal with the problem. Oreth looked around the room and made sure eye contact with no one as he moved past that unspoken option. He did not want it said out loud. Once it was said out loud, it became a different kind of meeting. What none of the 21 delegates in the inner chamber knew was that the meeting was not private. 6 years ago, when Hannah arrived at the council station as part of a maintenance contractor crew, she had taken a job in ventilation management. She was very good at her job. The system she maintained worked perfectly. The station's senior maintenance coordinator had twice recommended her for a commendation. Her real work happened in small, quiet moments over 6 years, installing very small things in very specific places. Things that recorded sound and transmitted it in compressed bursts during routine maintenance cycles, disguised inside normal system data. Hannah was not in the inner chamber. She was 4 corridors away in a maintenance access room, wearing her work uniform, eating a small meal from a container she had brought from her quarters. Her earpiece was very quiet. The recording transmission from the inner chamber ran directly to a receiver she had built into the wall panel beside her, disguised as a relay node. She listened to the entire meeting. When it was finished, she encrypted the recording and sent it to Wu through the same system he had been using the night before. Wu received the transmission at 09:14 station time. He decoded it, listened to it once, then walked to Junho's room and knocked on the door. Junho opened the door. He was already dressed. He had a cup of tea in his hand, made from a small supply he had brought from home because the station's food systems had never managed to produce anything he actually enjoyed. He looked at Wu's face and said, "How bad?" Wu told him. Junho nodded slowly. He drank some of his tea. He said, "Timeline." Wu said, "They haven't decided anything yet. They're stuck. None of their options work and they know it." Junho said, "Then today is still the right day." He finished his tea and set the cup down. He picked up a flat document case from his desk. He had packed it the previous evening, before the session, before the presentation, before any of it. The document inside had been in preparation for 8 years. The legal team in Geneva had worked on it through 4 different administrations and 6 different lead advisors. It had been reviewed by every major Earth government, every trade authority, every military command. It was 8 years old, and it had been revised 43 times. Junho considered it one of the most carefully made things he had ever held in his hands. He called Dane. She arrived in less than 3 minutes, slightly out of breath, with her tablet and a look on her face that said she already knew something was happening. He told her it was time for the document. She sat down and read through the final version one more time, not because she didn't know it, but because she wanted to be sure every word was still exactly right. The document was called the Saul Accord. It was not a declaration of war. It did not threaten anyone. It did not demand anything in aggressive language. It was, in form and structure, a perfectly standard council legal document, a renegotiation request. Humanity was formally requesting to revisit every treaty, every trade agreement, every border arrangement it had signed in its first 11 years of council membership, on the grounds that those agreements had been made without full information and under conditions of unequal standing. This was legal. It was always legal. Any council member had the right to request renegotiation of past agreements. The reason elder species never worried about this clause was that small, new species almost never had the resources or the legal expertise to actually pursue it. They might not even know the clause existed. Humanity had known about the clause for 9 years. They had spent 8 of those years preparing the document. The second part of the Saul Accord was an invitation. It was addressed to every small and mid-sized civilization in the Council that had experienced similar patterns of unfavorable agreements. It offered them a formal alliance, with Earth as guarantor, under a new framework that would give them collective standing in future negotiations. The framework was legally clean. It used existing council alliance structures, so it could not be challenged on procedural grounds. The invitation went out at 10:00 station time through official council communication channels. By 11:30, 41 civilizations had signed it. Dane had expected 30 at most. She stared at her tablet and counted again. 41. Then a 42nd while she was counting. Then a 43rd by the time Junho looked over her shoulder. At noon, Junho formally delivered the Sol Accord to Speaker Orath's official office. He delivered it in person, quietly, with no ceremony. The aide who received it looked at the cover page, then at Junho, then back at the cover page. Junho thanked him and left. At 14:00, Orath requested a direct meeting with Junho, not in the inner chamber, in one of the official small conference rooms used for real, recorded diplomatic conversations. Junho accepted and arrived exactly on time. Orath was already seated. He was a large creature, pale and composed, with the careful stillness of someone who had spent decades learning to show nothing. He looked at Junho for a long moment before speaking. Then he said, "What is it that your people actually want?" Junho sat down. He put the document case on the table but did not open it. He said, "A seat at every table, a voice in every vote, and the understanding that if either of those things are taken from us, we will not petition. We will not write another document. We will remember who we are and what we have always done when cornered." Orath was quiet. Junho waited. Outside the conference room window, the gas giant Velorum Prime turned slowly in the dark. Its colors moved in long, slow bands. It had been turning for billions of years. It would turn for billions more. The small political arrangements of small mortal species were, in the scale of such things, very temporary. Orath thought about the recovery rate in the Veldari research report. He thought about what that number meant practically, in terms of any long-term opposition to what the humans were asking for. He thought about the 43 signatures on the Alliance invitation, and the likelihood that number would grow before the next session. A young Veldari aide was standing near the back wall of the conference room, holding a tablet, waiting to take notes. He had not been in the inner chamber that morning. He had not read all the research reports. He had come into this meeting expecting to document a routine diplomatic exchange between a senior council leader and a minor member delegate. Now he was watching Speaker Orath's face, and trying to understand why the most powerful political figure in the galaxy was sitting quietly and carefully in front of a plainly dressed human who had arrived at this meeting alone. The aide leaned slightly toward the colleague standing next to him and whispered, "What exactly do they do when cornered?" The colleague had read the full history file, all 6 minutes of it, and the supporting documents attached. He had been reading it since the night before and was still not fully finished. He did not answer. He looked at the floor. 3 weeks passed. The station did not go back to normal. Some people tried to act like it had, going through their usual routines, attending minor sessions, filing reports, making small talk in the common corridors. But the normal feeling never came back. Something had shifted in the way the station existed, and everyone on it could feel the shift even when they were not thinking about it. The air was different. The conversations were quieter. People watched each other more carefully than they used to. The vote had been scheduled for the 21st day. Every civilization with council membership had been notified. The quantum stream broadcast had been prepared to carry the session to every corner of the known galaxy. The subject was simple and official: ratification of the Sol Accord. A yes vote would recognize it. A no vote would reject it. Every delegation had 3 weeks to read it, discuss it, and decide. In those 3 weeks, the number of co-signers on the Alliance invitation grew from 43 to 61. Several of those who signed were not small civilizations. 3 of them were mid-sized species with long council histories who had simply been tired for a very long time and had never had a reasonable moment to say so. The Sol Accord gave them that moment, wrapped neatly in legal language that could not be easily dismissed. The elder powers spent those 3 weeks doing what they always did when something complicated appeared on the horizon. They held private meetings. They made calls. They offered things to various delegations, quietly, in the language of informal relationships and future favors. Some delegations received those offers and reconsidered their support. Others received the offers and signed the alliance anyway. Dane tracked all of it. She slept very little. She drank an amount of coffee that Wu found genuinely alarming. She sat at her desk with 3 screens running and kept a live count of confirmed supporters on a board she had pinned to the wall of her small room. Every morning, Junho came to her door, looked at the board, and nodded. He never said much. She had learned that this was his way of saying everything was still on track. Wu spent the 3 weeks doing quieter things. He met twice more with Hana, in a maintenance corridor at a time when the surrounding sections were scheduled for air filtration cycles, and no one passed through. Hana gave him 2 more recordings from the inner chamber, and 1 from a private communication suite. None of them contained anything that required a dramatic response. The elder powers were uncertain and slow, which was exactly what Junho had predicted they would be. Wu sent brief summaries back to Earth each day. Earth sent back brief confirmations. Everyone was ready. On the morning of the vote, the Grand Hall opened its doors at 6 in the morning station time. By 7, every seat was filled. Not with aides or junior staff, but with full delegates, senior representatives, decision-makers. The session had drawn every species in the council in person, which was unusual. Normally, some delegations sent secondary representatives for minor votes. Today, no one had sent a secondary. Even the species that lived in environmental suits and found the station's atmosphere uncomfortable had shown up in their full gear and taken their assigned seats. The broadcast was the largest in recorded council history. The number of connected receivers across the galaxy had broken the previous record before the session even began. Junho arrived with Dane and Wu. He also arrived for the first time with 61 other delegations walking alongside them, not in a formal procession, not in ceremony. They simply walked in together in groups from the same corridor and found their seats in different parts of the hall. But the visual was clear. The pattern was visible. Anyone watching could see that something had changed about how those delegations moved. The session was called to order. Speaker Orath sat in the chair he had occupied for 40 years. He looked the same as always. His face showed nothing. His voice when he called the session to order was the same measured, formal tone it always was. Whatever he was thinking, it was not visible. The elder powers moved quickly at the start. It had been decided among them the night before to make one final attempt before the vote. The Veldari High Speaker who had made the joke about the unnamed species 3 weeks ago rose to speak. He was smooth and confident, which was his natural state. He presented a challenge to the legitimacy of humanity's FTL technology, suggesting that the rapid pace of Earth space development was inconsistent with an independent discovery, and that questions had been raised about the sourcing of certain key technologies. This was a very old tactic. It had been used 4 times in council history to strip young species of full membership standing. The logic was that if a species had not genuinely developed their core technologies, they could not claim the full standing that came with independent achievement. It was difficult to prove and difficult to disprove, and the process of investigation could take years, during which time a species standing was suspended. The hall was quiet. Several of the allied delegations shifted in their seats. A few looked toward Junho. Junho looked at Wu. Wu stood up. He was not a delegate. He held no official speaking rights. He was listed in the council's records as a military attaché, a secondary staff member, but he walked down the aisle anyway. And because no one had ever thought to tell the humans exactly what a military attaché was, and was not allowed to do, there was a brief moment of confusion among the procedural staff. And in that moment, Wu reached the floor and connected a drive to the podium's secondary display port, which was technically available to all registered delegation staff. He did not speak, he pressed play. The footage appeared on the holographic platform. It was raw and unedited, and it had been classified under Earth's internal records for decades, not because it was dangerous, but because it was personal. It was the original test flight of Earth's first faster-than-light vessel, not the official public broadcast version. The real footage, from the internal cameras inside the prototype ship. The ship was small. The interior looked cramped and crowded with equipment. The walls were covered in handwritten notes and printed checklists and small personal items that the crew had stuck to surfaces with adhesive. The crew was 6 people in simple flight suits. There was no ceremony visible, no speeches. In the minutes before launch, one crew member was arguing with another about whether a particular diagnostic reading was within acceptable range. A third crew member was eating from a small container of food, calmly, as if they were sitting in a break room somewhere on the ground. The mission parameters had been calculated at a survival probability of less than 30%. This was visible in a small data readout in the corner of the footage, which had not been removed. At the moment of jump, when the ship crossed into faster-than-light travel for the first time in the history of humanity, the footage caught all 6 faces. 3 of them were braced. One had closed their eyes. One was running a final check on a screen. And one, the crew member who had been eating, had put down the food container and was smiling. Not the smile of someone who was not afraid. The smile of someone who was afraid, and was doing it anyway because it was the most important thing happening anywhere in the universe at that specific moment, and they were there for it. The footage lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, the hall was silent. No civilization in the galaxy sent crews into untested faster-than-light travel at 30% survival odds. The standard threshold for any approved deep space mission was 92% minimum. The concept of launching 6 living beings into a technology that was more likely to kill them than not, with no external pressure forcing them to do it, and having them smile about it, was so far outside the normal parameters of what the galactic community considered rational behavior that it did not fit into any existing category. The Veldari High Speaker sat down slowly. He did not withdraw his motion formally. He simply sat down and did not speak again. The vote was called. It was not close. The Sol Accord passed with the support of 61 allied civilizations plus 17 others who had not signed the alliance but voted in favor. The final count was not a narrow margin. It was a clear statement. The accord was ratified. Humanity received permanent voting seats on every major council subcommittee, full sovereignty recognition for Earth's expansion corridors, and formal, official, recorded galactic recognition under its chosen name. The name was read into the official council record by a session recorder in a careful, measured voice. Earth, humans. The words were now part of the permanent archive of the Galactic Council. They would be there for as long as the archive existed. When the session closed and the hall began to empty, a delegate from a small ocean world in the outer systems made her way through the crowd to where Dane was standing. She was a quiet creature, small and blue-skinned, with large eyes that caught light easily. Her world had been a council member for 60 years, but had never once sat on a subcommittee. She had signed the alliance in the first day before most others, while many were still deciding. She stopped in front of Dane and looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "The name, Earth, humans. You named yourselves after the ground you came from. I have been thinking about this for 3 weeks. I want to understand why." Dane was tired. She had been awake for most of the previous 3 days. Her coffee had run out the day before. She thought about the question for a moment, not because it was difficult, but because she wanted to answer it well. She said, "Because no matter how far we go, we remember what it felt like to be standing on it, afraid, cold, small, surrounded by things that wanted to kill us, and choosing to get up anyway." The delegate looked at her for a long time. Then she turned and walked away without saying anything else. But her posture was different as she left. Something in the way she held herself had changed, quietly, in the space of a few seconds. Junho stood near the edge of the floor. The session was over. The hall was emptying. He watched the delegates move toward the exits in their ceremonial robes and their environmental suits and their cluster mine formations. He watched the Veldari leave in a group, talking quietly among themselves. He watched Orath walk out through the private door at the back of the head tier, flanked by his aides. Orath did not look back. Wu came to stand beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. The last delegates were filtering out. The lights in the hall were shifting to post-session mode, a softer and lower setting. Wu said, "They'll try again. Different approach, but they'll try." Junho said, "I know." Neither of them seemed particularly troubled by this. Junho reached into his jacket pocket and took out the small card he had written on 3 weeks ago. He looked at the 4 words he had written. "Today. We do it today." He folded it once and put it back in his pocket. He looked around the grand hall one more time. The 12,000 seats, the white stone floor, the transparent ceiling showing the stars and the slow-turning colors of Velorum Prime far below. He thought about a small wet planet at the edge of the Orion Arm. He thought about everything that planet had been through, everything it had burned and buried and rebuilt, everything it had survived and everything it had done to itself, and the fact that it was still there, still turning, still producing people who would get into untested ships with 30% survival odds and smile at the moment of launch. He thought that this was, all things considered, a very good day. 61 civilizations across the galaxy were that night updating their records, quietly, carefully, officially. In archives that had listed them as Sol 3 for 11 years, a new entry was being written. Not a coordinate, not a designation, not a number in a catalog. A name, the way it had always been meant to be written, the way it would be written from now on, in every record, in every document, in every reference across the known galaxy. Earth.